Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Vets to PM Military Transition Academy podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Misty Moreno. This podcast is dedicated to helping military service members and veterans achieve a meaningful and lucrative post-service career. We cover a wide range of topics from project management certifications to the DOD SkillBridge program and everything in between. In today's episode, we have the privilege of hosting Joel Martycz, who has been separated from the Air Force for 10 years. He shares with us how veterans need to stop majoring in the minors when it comes to the military transition and start focusing on developing who you are as a person. Joel shares his philosophy about wherever you go, and what the veterans should actually be focusing on during the military transition. Joel is an operations and supply chain executive in the healthcare industry with nearly 20 years of experience in manufacturing, repair, distribution, and fulfillment environments. He served in the Air Force for 8 years and utilized the GI Bill to earn multiple degrees to assist him in growing and developing in the civilian sector. Joel often shares tips and tools for the military transition on LinkedIn and volunteers his time to helping veterans find their way in the civilian sector. Join us as we discuss with Joel about what the veterans should actually be focusing on, how to deal with life stressors, and how to create the life you always dreamed of when you thought about separating or retiring from the military. Let's dive in. Welcome, Joel, to the show. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hey, Misty. Thanks so much for having me join today. My name is Joel Martycz. I'm an Air Force veteran. I did 8 years on active duty as an aircraft electrician, worked on C-130s and F-15s. I've had a really diverse and exciting kind of civilian career, primarily in operations leadership, but across a wide array of industries. So aerospace and manufacturing, retail, e-commerce, and over the past 3 to 4 years, I've been primarily in healthcare. So been really excited to kind of learn a lot of different ways to apply skills that I think are valuable. I am a product of the post 9/11 GI Bill. I'm a really proud product of the post 9/11 GI Bill. I finished my undergrad while I was on active duty, separated from the Air Force, and then completed an MBA and a master's with the help of the GI Bill. So proud to have that be kind of part of my post-military success.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you've been removed for 10 years, huh? Almost 10 years?
Yeah, it's at the stage where I've now been out and been a veteran longer than I was on active duty, which I think is kind of a meaningful tipping point where you start to realize we talk about veteran and service becoming a smaller part of your identity or not letting it be the only piece of your identity. But when you look at it kind of chronologically, it helps to put it in perspective like, oh, it's a relatively small period of your life that still holds so much meaning.
Yeah, I often say being a veteran is the least important thing about you. And I don't mean that derogatory, but it really is a very small part of your life, especially as you progress in age. I mean, I served for 20 and I've only been out for 4, but life is going fast. I can't believe that I've already been retired for 4 years. So you're absolutely right. One thing about you that I was attracted to on LinkedIn as far as following, I really like the veteran space, but I especially like veterans that talk about the nitty gritty stuff about the mental transformation, right? The piece where I don't think a lot of people are really wanting to get, integrated in because it's tough stuff, and one thing that you have told me before is that wherever you go, you go. So I often say, you're the same person when you retire, or when you separate. Like, I'm still Misty. I still work a lot. I still don't go to the doctors. I still don't do everything with my kid. I still don't put my family first. Those are things that we have to work on that you think are just going to go away because you are actually not serving in the military anymore. But that is not the case. So why don't you talk to us about your perspective on wherever you go, you go.
Yeah, and this was an aha moment that didn't really become clear to me until I'd say I started understanding it 5 years post-service, but honestly, it's an ongoing part of my own self-discovery and self-development. All the tactical stuff that's on LinkedIn and on the rest of the veteran transition space, it is important, right? Like understanding the VA processes, understanding how to interview well, how to build a resume, how to build a LinkedIn profile. All of those things matter. and they're relatively straightforward. They might feel overwhelming, but there's a formula, right? There
It's
are
a
people that can
checklist.
teach you. Yeah, it's a checklist. Here's what a good resume
Yep.
looks like. Um, and I think especially for those of us coming out of the military, most of us, if we're being honest, experience some anxiety and fear about that lack of structure. So what you're trying to do is say, oh, what checklist can I fill out to give me that sense of structure and sense of control and everything's okay? Meanwhile, I'm just going to ignore all these questions, like you said, of, oh, I'm not spending enough time with my family. I'm just going to ignore that and get my resume really, really good. And that's coming from a guy who does resume seminars for veterans. So I get it. I had that same that was kind of my transition. If I had to summarize it at a broad level, I did I majored really well in the minors. I had a great resume. I knew how to interview. I did all of those steps really well. I didn't do the work to work with my wife about what we think our post-military lifestyle is going to be like. How are we going to kind of divide parenting responsibilities and household responsibilities? And what kind of husband do you see me being? Not just what kind of husband do I want to be, right? So those conversations are a lot harder than, hey, let me make sure my checklist looks good for my LinkedIn profile. Um, and I think through having this moment of having kind of, I'd say, early career success, at least by the way I defined it, but still feeling unfulfilled and struggling with depression and anxiety, it forced me to kind of get more introspective. It was like, okay, well, nailing the career stuff clearly wasn't the secret ingredient.
Yeah.
What am I missing? And I think that's why I try to share that message back to other veterans that are closer to that exit stage now.
Yeah. And you said some key things there. The first thing that stuck out is, having the conversation with the people that are transitioning with you. I do believe that those are the major issues that we need to tackle. So when my husband and I both decided to retire on the same day, and my decision was pretty rash, his decision, he already knew and always knew that he was going to retire in September of 2020. I did not. I thought I was going to be a chief. But the first thing that we said to ourselves was, it doesn't matter where we want to live. It doesn't matter what we want to do. We have a 13-year-old child that's about to start, junior high, and we need to make sure that we are doing what he wants to do. So the first conversation that we had with him was, Maximus, where do you want to live? And he was like, I don't want to move anymore. I'm done. So I looked at Johnny and I was like, well, I guess we're living in South Carolina until he graduates. And then the other thing that you said was defining success according to you. So why don't you elaborate a little bit on why that is important for every veteran to do?
Yeah, so the big thing I talk a lot about, literally my go-to answer when I'm having veteran mentor sessions, and it's, hey, is there anything else I should think about? I say, what are your values? And very few people can define them. And this isn't a military specific problem either. I mean, you talk to your average person on the street and say, what are your values? They're going to look at you like you're, burning sage on the weekends. But when we talk about feeling fulfilled, that really comes from, there's like a resonation where what you're doing matches what's really in your soul, right? That quiet voice on the inside is matching what's going on, all the loud voices on the outside, and you feel like there's some harmony there. That can be very different for different people, right? There's going to be varying levels of how much money you want, how much power and influence you want, how much peace and relaxation and tranquility you want, what kind of mindset you want to be surrounded by, what kind of culture you want to be surrounded by. So understanding what's really important to you, and that those things can change, right? When I was early post-military, we were a sole income. I didn't have a retirement. I had no kind of pension to fall back on. I needed to increase my earning potential as quickly as I could.
Yeah.
As we got to a point where that had started to stabilize, and I felt like our personal family financial situation was a little bit more stable, I had to evolve my mindset and say, okay, an extra $5,000 or $10,000 a year is not nearly as important to me now as it was 3-4 years ago, right?
So
being
true.
willing to flex and evolve those definitions really matters too.
Yeah. And I always encourage, veterans, no matter what you're doing, if you're separating, if you're retiring, or if all of a sudden you're boarded medically and now like what you thought was going to be, a long career is now cut short. Take it 1 year at a time, because who I am now, 4 years later, is 100% different than who I was in September of 2020. So my definition of success in 2020 was really like getting my foot in the door, in a company, proving that I can do human resources in the civilian, sector, earning enough money to where we can just start, saving. And then, honestly, like putting my head down and just proving that I belong here. But my definition now is having, flexibility with my time, working on creative projects, working with people that want to work with me, and then just being, 60 to 70% involved in my husband and my child's life every single day, like being able to make them lunch when they get home from practice. Like I was just able to do that. That's something I wasn't able to do 4 years ago. So your definition of success is going to continuously evolve, but it's important to understand what that means, and one thing that you brought up is like, 5 to 10,000 extra dollars, like compared to time freedom or flexibility or being with my family is not that important. So what would you say to the veteran, that's saying, well, I'm worth this salary? I say 6-figure salaries require 6-figure work. So why don't you, elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good call out, and where people get hung up on the topic is there's a difference between what you're worth and what the market is willing to pay, or what you're willing to do to get what you're worth, right? Life is about trade-offs, and I think the quicker you realize that it's not about it's do I want to,
Whew.
the easier you can gain some power over that decision, right? Because can I go earn X amount of dollars doing whatever type of role? Sure, right? You could start dealing cocaine and make a lot of money that way too. That may not be the best choice with your personal values. So it's easier when you put it in an extreme like that. You're like, oh, of course I wouldn't do that. But then you have to be able to give yourself that view of, okay, will I trade being able to make lunch for my son after practice? Will I trade that for X amount of money? And there is probably a tipping point where, okay, for an extra $100,000, okay, the type of sacrifices that the family will make are going to be a little bit different. But the more you can detach emotionally and try to view those trade-offs, because that's really what you're making. But I think a lot of times when we end up dissatisfied, it's because we've been making those trade-offs and didn't make it consciously.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people believe, and although there's always exceptions to the rule, but just because you're serving in the military and you're signing a contract is that you have to make those trade-offs. And I would get a lot of hate for saying this. And I remember even a chief coming up to me and telling me, don't ever say that again. But I used to say to people, like, service before self doesn't mean service before self. What it means is that you are available, that this is a 24/7 sort of lifestyle. And so you have a go bag at the door, you have your family care plan good to go, you have money ready for your family, you have options for them, what you would do in 24 hours if you had to leave for 6 months, who's going to take care of your home, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't mean that you are pedal to the metal and you lose who you are, because even the Air Force and the military needs people that are of sound mind and body, right? And I'm sure that you can relate, but not everybody is walking around with a sound mind or body. So
yeah. Well, I think it's, like you said at the beginning, everywhere you go, you take yourself, and that includes in service and out of service, right? Yeah. This is something I talk about to my team that I lead now in my civilian job, is I don't need anybody burning themselves out running 14-hour days to get one big initiative through, because ideally we've got another big initiative coming up in 3 months and I need you able to do that one too. So yeah, service before self sometimes means prioritizing yourself so you're still there for your service.
Very good.
It has to be traded off and balanced.
It absolutely does, because you and I think, have talked about it before, but we both can relate. Once you lose like your cognitive ability to think straight, and where you're anxious or you're maybe depressed or whatever it may be, everybody around us suffers, including our work family and our, immediate family. So yeah, wherever you go, you go. So why don't you give us some tips and tools? You're 10 years out, on LinkedIn, you and I talk about it all the time. We see, people sort of making these assumptions about the application process, civilian work culture, civilians in general, whatever it may be. And so we know that there's not much we can control except who we are and how we react and how we respond, right? Essentially, how we navigate work and how we navigate, the organization. So 10 years out, what are some tips that you would give the person that's separating or retiring tomorrow?
Oh man, it's a long list of ideas.
Long list.
One of the first ones I would start with though is, as much as you can, try not to frame things up in military versus civilian world, because it's oversimplifying both worlds, right? When I say civilian world or I say military world, if I'm talking even within the Air Force, right? You and I were both Air Force. We had very different experiences. We were at different bases. We did different jobs. We interacted with different people. We went to different schools. Now you start to broaden that out and you talk different branches and special forces versus admin roles. Yes, everybody was in the military. Everybody had very different and diverse experiences. So when we say the civilian world, you have to understand there's that level at least of diversity and complexity. So you're trying to describe everything that's not your lived experience, and that's not a great way to think about it. So start to think, how can you create a framework of, are you looking at things by industry? Are you looking at by different companies? Are you looking at it by types of jobs? Then start to give a little bit of structure to the world you're imagining outside of the gate. I think that's where I would start.
Yeah, and I always say my experience is manufacturing. So, I worked at Continental Tire. Manufacturing is very different from other industries. And so, especially if it's a 24/7 operation and you have shifts, human resources in the manufacturing industry is going to be very different than human resources in hospitality or, whatever it may be. So that's a really good tip. What's another tip?
I think again, I'm going to keep calling back to understand yourself and again, quantify those trade-offs. So one thing I talk about or give advice a lot about is, do you want your search to be based on skills or be based on setting? I think it's too easy to get overwhelmed with the freedom that you have. You go from being told pretty much everything you're going to do to, I can pick anything, including doing nothing if I can afford it, right?
Yeah, right.
That can be overwhelming. So for the average veteran that's looking for some sort of a traditional, not necessarily 9 to 5 hours, but a 9 to 5 corporate type role, do you want your job search to focus around the particular types of problems that you want to solve and the skills you want to use to do that, right? Maybe you have a passion for Lean Six Sigma. Lots of different industries can use Lean Six Sigma. You could be in healthcare, you could be admin, you could be manufacturing. Or do you want the setting? So that's your skill search. Or do you want the setting to dictate it, right? Is it really adamant that you want maximum work-life flexibility? Do you need to have a remote role? Is there a particular type of culture that's really important to you? Or maybe your calling is to be in healthcare and you want to work in a patient-facing type of role. Well, then the setting is going to dictate your search. Another layer that might be, hey, maybe I am committed to living in South Carolina until my kids graduate high school.
Yeah.
Okay, now the setting is going to dictate some of it. Again, as you put a framework around these decisions and start to break them down, you're able to simplify and put some structure to it. So it can feel a little bit, coming back to that, I need a checklist kind of thing, but it's a checklist that you've chosen to pursue.
That's very good. So, frameworks is really my MO. And so when I was retiring, I identified my definition of success for 1 year. And then I also identified my non-negotiables. So those things that I will not do. So now that I'm out of the military, I don't need to travel, 60 to 70% of the year. I don't need to work night shift. Not even to get my foot in the door. I'm not working night shift. I will work somewhere else. I'm not going to work night shift because night shift just wrecks, wrecks my mental health and my family. So now that I have this framework, I was able to go and start the application process, the interview process, and essentially look for a job. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk some hands-on, practical advice for the job search for the veteran. So I know that you have some experience with that. So what's one of the biggest lessons that you learned when you were job searching, or even now when you're part of the hiring process?
So I think the number one, the thing that I think stands out, I hear a lot of talk about building a network and networking, and you see it on LinkedIn. And I think there's just a conceptual flaw with how a lot of veterans are thinking about. They think that networking means I connected with Misty, I sent her a message, and now I'm looking for this really transactional benefit from knowing her. And don't get me wrong, there are occasions where if it's a recruiter or a hiring manager that's really specifically looking for something, it may be that you're reaching out saying, hey, you need talent. I have talent. Let's make this happen. More often than not, networking is really a long game. I'll give you an example of kind of how that worked in real life in my career. At my second civilian employer, I was our building's safety captain, right? So I was in charge of making sure fire extinguisher dates were good and emergency exits and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
We had an audit from somebody who was assigned to headquarters, who came down to the distribution center I worked at to do the audit, right? I was assigned to follow him around. I was showing him the safety binders and checking all the stuff, things that I'm sure a lot of our Air Force and other vets are really familiar with that concept.
I have like a lot of PTSD concerning that.
Yeah, you're just like, oh, like no more audits. Yeah. But so I do this audit with this guy from headquarters. I connect with him on LinkedIn, and I did not follow up again for years. Never wasn't, hey, let's hang out, let's grab drinks. It was just adding someone to my professional extended network. Fast forward, I think this was about 5 years later or so. He posted a role he was at my current employer now. He posted a role that was literally perfect. I mean, it looked like I wrote the job description for myself. So I reached out, sent him a message. Hey, not sure if you remember, but here's where we met. I applied for the job. Here's my resume. Let me know if you have any questions. And long story short, I ended up getting the interview because I had reached out, went through the interview process, got the job. I see vets get on LinkedIn, get really active, build a lot of connections that, they don't have a sense of who they are or where they're connected to, and then leave LinkedIn entirely. Had I ghosted LinkedIn post-military, I probably wouldn't have seen that opportunity pop across my feed. So staying active and understanding that you're playing a long game really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to networking, I do tell the veteran community, there's this misconception that if you have 500 connections or 5,000 connections, whatever the number is, it's like, oh, your profile will get seen. Yeah, we have to be careful with why we're doing what we're doing. So for me, it's like, I'm going to deposit into my network before I withdraw, and so what value can I add to this, veteran military transition space, and how can I pour in to the people that are watching my post, or whatever it may be. We have to think about how can we deposit, and the people that post the green banner, I'm open to work, there is utility in that, but we also have to be careful. You're asking us to go out on a limb and vouch for you when you haven't deposited anything into the network yet, or just be mindful of what you're asking for, because I'm very cognizant of who I refer, because that is a reflection on me, right? So you just have to be a little wary about that stuff.
And I think there's two points you bring up. I want to come back to LinkedIn content creation for new vets in a second, but when we talk about getting referrals, there's kind of two broad categories. There's the name that I happen to know and I'll pass a resume along, which is real, like I said, and that's what that connection was that ended up leading my job. It was, hey, I think I'm a good fit. Here's why. I made it easy for him to say, yeah, that looks like it might work. Let's pass your name to the recruiter. That's your first level referral.
It's 1.0.
But then that's 1.0. And then 2.0 is really, hey, I've worked with Misty before, or I know her skill sets really, really deeply. kind of that thing of what are they saying about you behind closed doors or in rooms that you're not in. I also say like, who are your couch moving friends, right? Because if somebody would show up to your house and help you move a couch, they'll probably go to bat with a hiring manager to try to get you a job. You can use both, right? Now, especially getting out of the military, you may not have a ton of couch moving friends that are in a hiring position.
Yeah.
What that means is if you're doing those 1.0 connections, you need to make it super easy. Don't send me a resume and say, hey, grateful for any advice or input you can have. Like, man, I want to help everybody that I can, but I do not have the time to read your resume, guess what you did, especially if it's like somebody in the Navy, I'm trying to translate. Maybe I understand it, maybe I don't, and then figure out what you would be good at. Like, I can't do all of that. Versus if you send a message and say, hey, I'm just getting out of the Army. Here's my background. I'm really good at this and this. I'm looking for a role that lets me do this. I saw this role on your company's website. Do you know anything about it, or do you have any advice? Now it's narrowed down enough that if I do think there's a connection I can draw easily, yeah, I can email a resume if it makes sense. But don't ask me to move a couch if we're not couch moving friends. So make that couch really light if you're a 1.0 connection.
Oh, I love that. That's gold right there. And, for those people that are saying, well, I don't do social media, I don't do LinkedIn or whatever it may be, that's valid, right? It's okay to say you don't do that. I have tons of friends in my, in my circle that say, I'm not a technology person. And I'm like, that's okay. I truly live with the let them theory. I'm going to let you not be a tech person, right? I'm going to let you not be a LinkedIn person. But we also have to take ownership of what can we control, right? In this job market, especially the job market today, what can we control? And building a personal brand, building connections, showing up, standing out as maybe an industry expert or even just an expert within 20 people on LinkedIn, you know what I mean? That is going to help you with those things that you can't control. So what do you say to people that say, well, I don't want to get on LinkedIn. I don't want to do it.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated topic. The number one thing I actually share to a lot of vets is that LinkedIn looks very different to transitioning military than it does to your average civilian who has no military affiliation. And I kind of know that because when I got out of the Air Force, I didn't really have a ton of military connections. I wasn't following a lot of the big space. There's a lot more influencers in the military space now than there were in 2014. But so most of my connections were just organic people that I had met at my job, and they were using LinkedIn kind of in a different way. So number one, don't feel like you have to model what you're doing on LinkedIn off of a lot of the more popular influencers. Most of the big names and big influencers on LinkedIn own a business that in some way their revenue is tied to military employment. Yeah. Right. And that's not a knock. I'm just saying that's their business strategy. So they're on social media, hopefully creating value and giving good advice, but they have to be present because that's the top of their funnel. If you are, Airman Snuffy looking for a job, you don't necessarily have to create a ton of content.
Nope.
I would recommend being on LinkedIn, and how I would do it if you're not big on posting and putting all the selfies and the content strategy. In fact, I would say what's more valuable than that is building some connections, setting up Zoom calls or local meetups to really have real conversations, right? So if I reach out to Misty and say, hey, it looks like your career path is something I want to model and follow, can I set up a 30-minute Zoom to learn more about how you got to where you are? Now I'm starting to close the distance between 1.0 Misty and 2.0 Misty in terms of a connection that might refer me.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest piece I would recommend. So a lot of folks are spending their time on LinkedIn, and I see people that are still on active duty giving military transition advice. I think I would caution that, like, make sure you have your strategy dialed in and you're building your network. I didn't create any content or really talk about the military transition until 6 to 8 years post-service, where I felt like I had proven that I had learned a couple things that were worth sharing.
Yeah, I mean, and I started pretty early. I was very cognizant about what I was speaking about, though. I don't speak too much about, like logistics. It's more about the mental transformation, because I'll be honest with you, I actually thought I was going to have like way more of a difficult time, mentally transitioning than I actually did. I mean, if I were to sum it up, I mean, my transition has been super smooth and super successful mentally and job wise, right? So one thing about LinkedIn too is, you don't have to create content. When I was sourced by LinkedIn, by Continental, by their recruiter, and just for grins and giggles, I asked her, her name is Marissa, and I never will forget her because one, she gave me a chance. Her informational interview was spot on. Like the questions that she asked were so role specific, but she made them like Misty specific, right? Like what kind of environment do you thrive in? When you think about the environments that you've worked in the past, what kind of environment do you really enjoy working in? Like those were the questions that I was like, wow, like I feel like she knows me. And she told me like, I found you because your profile is searchable. You had human resources business partner in the profile. You had veteran in there because, there's a lot of affirmative action initiatives that include females, veterans, so once you know the hiring process, you can just optimize your LinkedIn profile, never post, and the recruiters that have the backdoor LinkedIn will find you, but you just have to optimize it. That's why, there's lots of schools of thought, and I'm sure you have a few too, but whatever LinkedIn says to do for your profile, do it because it's, again, something that you can control, right?
Yeah. And I'd say especially that understanding, and this does evolve, right? In the past 10
Yes.
years, how recruiters use LinkedIn has changed in minor ways. Understanding kind of the search engine elements of that and how recruiters find the people they're looking for. And there are a ton of awesome recruiters, especially in the military space, that publish content kind of showing, hey, here's what I see on the back end of LinkedIn. Setting your profile up is something really important. I can give a really small example of that. So my current LinkedIn, obviously, it almost feels like I have kind of two. I have my professional job, which is not in the military transition space. And then I do a lot of military related content. But if you look at my actual profile, it's all set up for Joel, the operations leader.
Yep.
My day job title includes the word pharmacy in it, right? I work within a healthcare company. I work in the pharmacy space. So my signature block on my work email has pharmacy operations in it. The problem that I noticed was that the recommended jobs that LinkedIn was sharing were all more clinical. I'm not a pharmacist. I'm not a clinician. I want ideally LinkedIn to think of me as an operations executive. So seeing that was good feedback that, okay, I need to tweak my job title ever so slightly on LinkedIn. Nothing outright, I'm not inflating, I'm not lying, but maybe it could be something as simple as taking the word pharmacy out and just having operations leader to make sure that it tailors the kind of roles and how you engage with the roles that work for you. That's another way of like letting LinkedIn give you feedback on, hey, how is my profile showing up? Because the robot is kind of looking and saying, here's what we think we know about you. How does that match up? You get to influence that robot a little bit.
Absolutely. And then just really taking inventory. I have a sort of a battle rhythm where the first of the month, I'm always updating my resume, making sure that it's current, adding anything significant from the last month there, because you never know, right? Especially in today's job market, you just never know. So you want to be ready. That includes updating my LinkedIn, but I'm very cognizant about changing things too often as well. So I change it once a month, and look at my analytics just to see, is this effective? And so that's one thing that I always tell veterans is stop asking, is this right or is this wrong? And start asking, is this effective? Based on your definition of success, based on your goals, based on the objectives that you've set, is this effective? And if you're not getting seen, if you're not getting, sourced or asked to, for informational interviews, then maybe there's something that you can, tweak a little bit. But you also have to be mindful too, like it takes time, right? It takes time.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the time that it takes, to like from LinkedIn for an interview, stuff like that. Like what are some of my biggest tip is like, you have to be super patient, but take action, take massive action based on your goals, and so for me, it started with LinkedIn. And then I just, accepted every informational interview. I asked for informational interviews. I accepted every physical interview. And for me, it was all about what can I learn from this process? So what are some tips that you have when it comes to learning, from the process?
I think we talk about setting up a framework. You want to make sure that there's a little bit of flexibility in that, right? So if you looked at my career at a high level, I went from fixing F-15s to working on rockets to shipping dog food to compounding pharmacy clean rooms. It is a wide array of things that I've done, and there's no possible way that Staff Sergeant Martycz getting out of the military in 2014 could have possibly predicted that path and followed it. So to your point, kind of saying yes to things and not being so locked in on what you think you understand.
Yeah.
That it causes you to miss opportunities. So having the general direction, again, I knew kind of the skills that I wanted to bring and how I wanted to show up to employers. And then I always had a rough, fuzzy goal of what the next couple years would look like. And then I let that view become clearer as I got closer. I think getting comfortable with that. And then to your point earlier about, on a longer scale, updating your LinkedIn, how are you updating your values assessment, your long-term career vision, your 3 and 5 year plan for your family, for yourself? Start with a really clear next couple of weeks and then be comfortable that it'll get more blurry as you get further into the future.
Absolutely. My framework was, I've spoken about this, but every day I would come home from work and I had a calendar on the right-hand side. So when I walked in my garage door, I had this huge calendar and I would either put a check or an X on the day. So this is when I came home from work. And my framework was to ask myself, was my definition of success honored and fulfilled today? And obviously, it has a lot to do with the way that you respond and you react and whatever it may be. But every single day I would do that. So at the end of every month, I would look at how many checks I had, how many X's I had. And I said that if I have more than 50%, then I need to start thinking about my next steps. But I started that process in June of 2020, and it wasn't until January 2023 where I was like, oh, I have more X's than checks. So I need to start making something happen. So my framework was continuing every single day to do that, but also in the background, taking action, updating LinkedIn, starting to connect a little bit more, talking to my connections. Hey, just so you know, I'm not going to advertise it, but I am looking for a different opportunity. And so if you know of anything at your company, I know we've talked before, and then it wasn't until January 2024 where I moved on. And so I know that you have moved, a couple different times in your 10 years. So what is some advice for veterans who say, well, I just want to find the job that's going to be the job, And so what do you say to veterans like that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is the reality of the world is no job is guaranteed. And that's not a knock on any particular employer. It's the reality of business in the world. Even if you start your own business, that's not guaranteed. You're going to have to fight every day to keep that business thriving. So understanding that things will change, like you said at the beginning, the only thing you can control is your reaction to it. I think it's number one, you can feel that day-to-day contentment. And the more, this is a, kind of a mindfulness thing, the more I can focus on what do I have to do today, right? To put that X on the calendar, that check mark on the calendar instead of an X, the easier it is to kind of find that flow state and not worry about the future as much because there are things you can't predict. I think that's a big piece of it.
Yeah.
And realize, I use baseball metaphors sometimes, the best baseball players in the world will only get a hit 3 times out of 10, right? So it is okay. You need to refine or update your definition of success, that your goal is not to get up there and hit a home run every single time, right? To your point, you are not going to get 100% success rate with every single outreach to a recruiter, with every interview you do. your job is to kind of go up there and get really good at bats. So if you feel like you did the right research, you prepped for the interview well, you're proud of how you showed up, there are going to be times where you show up and do the absolute best you could in an interview. And either that wasn't the right fit, those weren't the right leaders for you, that wasn't the right company culture. Like that stuff is going to happen. So focus on kind of putting in your effort and not letting the future outcomes kind of drive you crazy.
Yeah. And one thing that really clicked for me was I have a value statement, like a mission statement. This is who I am. So my sort of mission in life is to develop better human beings who go on to develop better human beings. So
I love that.
Yeah, like so in the last year at Continental, I love Continental. It was a fantastic experience, but it wasn't fulfilling my definition of success, right? And the company did not change. So when I started day one and when I left 3 years and 7 months later, like nothing changed, but I changed, right? And so I just kept saying to myself, my vision is to develop better people who are developing better people. And it's getting progressively harder to do that here. So maybe I can do that somewhere else. And then also I flipped my mindset a little bit and said, there's no dream job out there. And I really don't think that there is. I do think that there's dream job aspects, right? And so at Continental, like the best part of my day was being on the production floor, talking with those people, and then always being in a room where I felt like I was not the smartest person in the room. And I loved that because I felt like I was always learning, right? And at Continental, I was learning and earning. I was very blessed where I was, learning tons of things. I walked out of there a totally different person than I was when I first stepped foot. And, I was able to earn a lot of money because they were just so gracious and paid me, to do what I did there. But not every job has to fulfill your passion. Not every job has to be a job where you learn, and not every job has to be a job where you earn, right? And so it's really just understanding like the job market is a little complex out there and it's not like the military. So we need to stop trying to make it the military. It doesn't have to fulfill our passions. We can fund our passions with our job.
I think for all but a very, very select list of civilians, your job is not your identity. And that's just not in the military. Who you are and what you do are the same thing. They are meshed, they are married. On the civilian side, almost nobody views themselves that. Now they may describe, oh, I'm an accountant, but nobody is like feeling like being an accountant is their ultimate purpose in that time frame of why they're on Earth, right? So understanding that careers are a continuum and all work, it's about those trade-offs, right? How many things that I don't love will I exchange for other benefits, whether that's time, flexibility, money, power, whatever it is that you're willing to trade off. I think the more you can contextualize that decision, the better. And again, the stronger your definition of who you are is, the easier you're able to view that and the less culture shock. I think, especially I see it with senior NCOs and officers where you think if you get to E8, E9, 06, you're a commander, you're a chief, whatever, that is so much responsibility and so much of who you are to all of a sudden just take that away. If you don't have a really solid definition of who you are underneath that beforehand, when those stripes come off, it's going to be heavy.
Yeah. And I am so happy that, that I was mentored to do the work prior to getting out, because someone asked me 2 days ago, they asked me like, what do you miss the most about the military? And he went on, like before I could even answer, he went on and told me about what he missed, and he missed the camaraderie. And I love this guy, but I always tell him like, you get amnesia. Like, I remember when you would come to me and you would say that you're getting out of the military because of XYZ. And now all of a sudden it's like the military was the best thing that ever happened to you. And don't get it twisted. I had a great military career, but the military is not always this well-oiled machine. Like we still have human beings, and where there's human, there's error. We still have process issues. We could get political, but like, look at the way, Afghanistan drawdown and stuff like that. Like that's the military. So let's not think that it's the best thing ever, but he went on and just talked about everything that he missed, of the military. And he's like, okay, so what do you miss? And I was like, a dedicated place to put my pens. Like, seriously, I miss a place to put my pens. And he laughed. And then, he was like, you know what I mean? I'm like, no, like it's not that I don't miss anything, but if I were to be 100% honest with you, Joel, I really don't miss anything. And it's not because it was terrible, but it's because I made a decision to retire and I am truly living my best life, like truly living my best life. And so, yeah, the only thing I really miss right now is just a dedicated place to put my pens. So, but what do you say to veterans that are scared that they're not going to find, what they think that they had in the military, in the civilian sector?
Yeah, I think I do love your comment about the grass is not always green, and that's both ways, right? When people are in the military and they're saying, "Oh, when I get to the civilian side, it's going to be dot dot dot," and yeah, you hear, "Oh, when I was in the military, nobody was lazy or nobody skipped out on work or nobody whatever." Like, yes, they did. Like, we are humans, right? Like, not disparaging the military. Obviously, like I love the military. I love what it stands for, and there are people who make bad decisions and do bad, unethical things in the military. That's the reality. So acknowledging that is very important. But the thing beyond that, right, is that's 101 as you evolve your understanding. It's that the things that meant the most to most of us about the military, when you think, serving a higher calling or being dedicated to something larger than yourself, and the sense of community and camaraderie that comes with that, like there's nowhere that it's written that that's an exclusive function of the military, right? So one of my core values is service, and I've found that in a lot of different ways, right? I try to stay really involved in my kids' sports and help as helpful as I can. I spend a lot of time coaching and mentoring other veterans. That's part of me feeling that I'm part of this bigger veteran community, right? I'm giving to something bigger than myself. Same thing with community. First off, there's a community for most of us within our four walls at home that a lot of us tend to ignore sometimes. So
yeah,
pouring in and being
sloppy seconds. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Being a good husband, father, mother, daughter, whatever it is, like being a good family member is much harder than writing a good resume. So putting the effort in there is really, really meaningful. And then again, like what is the community outside of it? Is it your local HOA? Is it your kid's school? Is it your church? Is it your gym? Like there are people out there there's a loneliness epidemic in America. There are people out there that want to connect and want that community. You can find that. And for everybody that talks about, they were a leader in the military, again, leadership's not a military exclusive topic. You can bring that leadership to those communities. You can be the person to start that meetup group or to start that local coffee or to show up to that networking event. Build that community and that sense of camaraderie, but that work is going to come down to you. I think the difference is kind of gets issued to you in the military, right? You show up to a new base. Here are my friends for the next couple of years. You can go find those people. And the cool thing is you get to pick. Occasionally there's some people that maybe the military issued and you're like, I would have done okay if I didn't have to spend 4 years with them. You get to make those choices here. So embrace that.
Yeah. And and it's all about taking action. I hear a lot of people, I mean, there's, every social media app that you look at, LinkedIn, whatever, it's like, oh, they're not your work family and, whatever it may be, but they can be. So if you I absolutely love having relationships with the people that I work with, because the truth of the matter is that most of the time you're spending more time with them, right, in some way, shape, or form than your actual family. So my continental teams, the two teams I was on, the HR team and the industrial engineer team, those were the two best teams ever in my entire professional career. I'm sure it's because I'm a little different, but it's because I want camaraderie. I want my work family to I want to call them that, you know what I mean? And I want to have fun. And we send memes to each other. We buy each other candy from the snack bar. Hey, I know that you have a deadline. Is there anything I can do to help you? That's what I wanted. And I didn't necessarily have that in the military. And I think it's because I didn't go and take action. And so one of my non-negotiables was to enjoy the people that I work with. I'm not going to show up to work and not have a good time. I'm not doing it. I will leave an organization super fast. And so I took action. So it's all about taking action. So as we close, Joel, what are some actions that veterans can take today to ensure that they are who they want to be, who is going to show up, in the military, in the civilian sector, in their homes? What are some actions they can take?
Yeah. I think this is the Seneca quote, but it's, if a man doesn't know which port he's sailing to, no wind is favorable. I think the bulk of the effort, if you're new and newly transitioning, or maybe you're a couple years post-military and you're still struggling with some of that identity crisis stuff or that, those challenges, you really have to invest the time in understanding who you are. And I mean, strip away everything. Don't worry about what your spouse thinks. Don't worry about what your kids, your parents think. Don't worry about what coworkers or other people on LinkedIn think. If none of us had any titles or rank or anything that externally defined us, who would you be? Like I said, what would resonate with your soul? Start with that and then start to think, what would this look like if I stayed as true to that as I could? And then be realistic about making some trade-offs along the way of how much variability will I accept to these core values to live the life that I really want. I think that is the number one thing that I just try to encourage everybody to. The big actions that specifically have been helpful for me on that, there are some great value-seeking exercises through a variety of websites. You can find a lot that are free. You can do some that are paid. And then journaling is a really, really powerful tool. I can't say enough about the days where you're feeling really stuck or really overwhelmed, or you've got too much running through your head to process. Just get down in front of a notebook or a computer and bleed it all out, let it run through. You'll be shocked at how much clearer things feel after you dump it out on paper.
Yeah, it's such a good exercise. I mean, I do it every morning. So when I drink coffee, it's like free flow journaling. I mean, sometimes when I read back, I'm like, oh, oh my, and then sometimes it's like, that's my best material. I might be writing posts. You never know what comes out of that journal, but that's a really good place to start, and one thing that really helped, there's not a lot of people talking about the military transition on the family. And we have to be careful we're not the only ones going through a military transition, right? So my husband and I retired the same day and we were always a mill-to-mill couple. So we met in the military, and so we transitioned too, our relationship transitioned too. And so one thing that we did to make sure that we stayed true to ourselves and stayed true to our marriage and stayed true to our son was he asked me 3 things that I needed from him. And I asked him, what do you need from me? And those 3 things,
I love that.
Those are the only 3 things that we focus on. Those are the only 3 things that we can fight about, right? Those are the only 3 things that should take up space in this crazy world that we're living in. And so that's one exercise that really helped me narrow down what I'm focusing on. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Military Transition Academy podcast. If you found today's episode helpful, please share it with your fellow veterans and friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Please connect with Joel on LinkedIn to see how a veteran is living his best life after serving in the military. You can also find the Vets to PM team on LinkedIn and sign up for a free account at vets2pm.com/training to start utilizing the tools and resources that will help you achieve a meaningful, lucrative, and post-service career. Take care and talk to you soon.